that great art is meant to trigger you in some circumstances. Can you sort of talk us through that?
Well, the funny thing about the Theodora production is that there was this great 3-star review afterwards that said, you know, opera goers are very used to gore and sex and all that kind of stuff. And actually that this production was really tame and everyone was kind of waiting for the terrorism and all that stuff to kick in.
So it raised expectations a bit too much.
So that can partly be why trigger warnings are a problem, because they make you think something's going to happen that isn't. But what I was trying to argue is that the whole way in which we interact with art, whether it's a film or a book, and by the way, you know, great art and also crap art, is that we're meant to come to it from our own kind of authentic experience. Now, people read reviews of books. People, to a certain extent, are prepped, and they might, you know, see clips of it online. But that experience that we have with a work, particularly with things like painting or a great classic, has to be some kind of interaction between two forces, between you and the artist, the author, the person, you know, the composer. And I think trigger warnings just get in the way of that. Really what it is an imposition from the publisher or the curator, these people who a lot of the time don't have much talent, to come in and basically stick their oar in. And I think that there probably are a lot of artists and writers who are turning in their graves at some of the stuff that's tagged onto their great works.
So then what would you say to the argument that, well, you know, we always put warnings on films, the BBFC often say there's scenes of sexual nature, etc., as a kind of guide for parents. Would you say that that should be distinguished from the kind of warnings you're talking about?
Well, the thing about kids and adults is that, I mean, obviously we have a watershed, we have all these rules that say that we don't allow children to just wander into pornographic material or violent stuff.
Yeah.
And that's fair enough. We don't want kids to get upset. But really, trigger warnings are actually about adults, and they're mainly about university students. So the Mail on Sunday's been spending all its time sending out freedom of information requests to university and has found that, for example, at the University of Aberdeen, students were told that Julius Caesar centred around a plot on murder. Now, that's just a plot spoiler. I mean, it's, you know...
But it's not really a plot spoiler. It's something they should already know, right?
I'm being I'm being too generous to students. I mean, there was a trigger warning on Harry Potter at one university, and I think, why are students learning about Harry Potter at university? That's for another rant. But there's this suggestion that trigger warnings are really just about kind of being appropriate.
Yes.
But if you are past the age of, if you are into adulthood, then what becomes appropriate for you is completely subjective. And actually, with particularly students at universities, we should be pushing the idea that the idea of appropriate or safe or comfortable for them should be thrown out of the window, because I think some of the best experiences I ever had was when I was completely taken out of my comfort zone. And there's also a kind of an element of, I want to be really cruel, kind of narcissism to a lot of this, because a lot of the time you hear defenders of trigger warnings say, well, it just helps me have a better experience if I know, as, you know, a rape survivor or as, you know, abuse survivor, that there's this kind of content in there. Now, we want to live in a sympathetic world, and it's probably not very nice going around feeling, you know, reliving experiences from your past that are pretty horrible. But that's not what's supposed to happen when you interact with art. You know, when you go to stand in front of Picasso's Guernica for the first time, you're not meant to necessarily, it's not meant to make you relive your own trauma. You're meant to be thinking about Franco. You're meant to be thinking about the things that happened then. And then the way in which great art works is that there's layers. Maybe your experience comes out later. Maybe, you know, I went to see Paula Rego recently, and first of all, you're looking at a kind of dog human kind of, and then you think that's disgusting, and then you take a while and you see something else. And I think that the kind of impositioning trigger warnings gives a very superficial view, because you just, for example, you know, if you go along with what some universities are doing and say, like, the Merchant of Venice trigger warning racism, anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
That's not what the Merchant of Venice is primarily about.
Yes.
And to read it in that way would be to be doing both Shakespeare and yourself a disservice.
It's an interesting perspective that you take, because, I mean, it's very easy, isn't it, to mock some of the more egregious examples of trigger warnings. I mean, if you take I think there's one at UCL on an archaeology course as a trigger warning, you may see remains or bones or dead bodies, and I would have thought that's quite an obvious thing. But there is a kind of broader question about the infantilism of this kind of stuff. Is that, you know, someone taking a course like that, someone taking a course in literature or the classics, surely must be adult enough to know that it might contain such themes and this kind of thing. But then that has to be balanced, or does it have to be balanced, with the argument that it can reignite trauma, and that all we're doing is just making these courses more inclusive?
I think we have to be really hard on this, which is that if you are, you know, once you become an adult and enter into the world, never mind the extremely safe space of a university campus, things are going to happen to you that will make you relive trauma, or that will, be unpleasant. You'll see something on the street that will remind you of a past boyfriend, or, anything from the superficial to the serious. Life is not a kind of walk in the park. The good things about life only, and particularly the good things about art, only become apparent. The wonderful things, the sublime things, the things that make you cry with joy, are also only available to you if you understand that there is horror and terror and death. Some of the greatest comedies centre around terrible things. We have dark humour for a reason. And it's just pretty... I think it's pretty childish to suggest that you should be allowed to walk... I don't know why you would want to walk around in a world in which people were pretending, because that's what a trigger warning is, really.
Yes.
It's a pretense.
But it does also impact on the artist's vision in some circumstances. I was talking to a guy from the Welsh Opera, and they had a production of Dead Man Walking, and the production opened with, because it's a man on death row, and the big sort of thing about it is that he's guilty, and so you have to wrestle with the idea of, do we want even guilty people to be absolved from the death penalty? But the production started with a brutal rape scene, which showed that he was guilty. It's quite a bold artistic choice. But the theatre emailed ticket goers and said, there's a graphic scene at the start, you might want to arrive 10 minutes late. And by doing that, they are effectively interrupting or disrupting what the artist or the creative mind behind that thing is trying to achieve. Maybe they wanted people to be shocked and horrified as part of the experience.
Yeah, I think that what it also does is, what you're saying is, it can twist the meaning. So I was reading this short story by Ralph Ellison last night called Jaime's Bull, and Ralph Ellison is a black American writer. And basically it centres around, not trigger warning, spoiler alert, that's more, but a black bum who's riding the trains, killing a white racist guy who's there to police the bums and get them off the train. And the whole nature of the interaction is, first you see that there's obvious racism, then the black guy turns around and kills the white guy. And so if you had a trigger warning saying, warning murder or warning racism, all of the subtlety of what was going on there and what picture Ellison was trying to paint of a kind of precarious life with that you could do terrible things, but they might be justified in a particular context. And all the politics swimming around that would be lost to you. It would completely neutralise the very important sting when Jaime takes the knife out of his pocket and kills the bull. So I think it's certainly, I use the term in the article, sanitises, because particularly things that are meant to shock you. So at one university had a trigger warning for murder and child abuse and poverty for Dickens's Oliver Twist. And I mean, anyone who reads that and reads Nancy being abused and then murdered and, reads all of that, reads the poverty of the kids in that book and needs some kind of trigger warning to buffer them is, I think, a little bit kind of inhumane. It's like you're not really interacting with, you're not having a genuine, authentic experience. And I think we might be creating kind of little monsters who are going around not actually ever feeling pain or feeling the right thing that you're meant to feel when art reflects life towards,
Is there also the risk that it's sort of accentuating this notion that words can be dangerous, or that paintings can be dangerous, films can be dangerous, and it would just encourage this idea, encourage trauma, in fact, where it may not exist?
Well, there's that side of it, but then there's also, and this is something I think a lot of free speechers like us don't like getting into because it's kind of dangerous territory. But words can be extremely powerful. They can, even to use that word that no one wants to use, incite people into action. That's why revolutionary poetry is written. That's why paintings like Guernica were produced by people who wanted to say something and inform a kind of movement in a world where things were happening. And if we start to treat words in these kind of like isolated things. So if you see something like a character like Fagin, or you see isolated the N-word, that is in itself just kind of either neutered of all power or all powerful in itself, that it has no context. I think that's the problem. You have to look at words and images in their context. What's the artist trying to say to you? Do they really want you to just be upset by using the N-word here and just in a kind of superficial way, or are they saying something broader? Just getting young people to use their minds a little bit. I think we can do a disservice to the university students to suggest that they are, walking around like needing cotton wool and that they're all sort of falling apart reading stuff. Actually, most of them aren't. I think that a lot of the time there's preemptive moves by university administrations who don't want to get bad press on Twitter, essentially. And who aren't ballsy enough to say to the 3 students who complain on a literature degree, or shut up, And I think most students are actually there because they want to broaden their minds and are just getting on with it.